The baby's scream tore through the 14th floor like a fire alarm nobody could shut off. Every single person in that private hospital wing froze. Nurses, doctors, 3 security guards standing at the door. All of them locked up the same way, shoulders tight, eyes wide, searching the room for whatever danger had just walked in. But nothing had walked in. The danger was the touch itself. Demarion Calloway, one of the most feared men in the entire northeastern United States, stood 2 feet from the crib and could not move. His hands, the same hands that had built a shipping empire worth $4 billion, the same hands that had signed contracts that moved half the cargo coming through the Maryland coast, those hands were completely useless right now. Because the moment he had reached into that crib 30 seconds ago, and his newborn son had screamed like the world was ending, and he was still screaming. The head nurse, a woman who had worked private pediatric wards for 22 years and had seen everything twice, stepped forward with her hands raised like she was calming a crowd. She leaned over the crib. She made soft sounds. She reached in with practiced, careful hands. The baby screamed harder. Demarion stepped back, his jaw locked, the muscles along the side of his face pulled tight and stayed there. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Have you ever watched someone you love suffer and realized that every single thing you tried only made it worse? Because that is exactly where Demarion was standing right now. And the most terrifying part, this was not the first time. This had been happening for 6 weeks straight. Hi viewers, I kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. 6 weeks, 42 days. Every doctor in New York had been through that room. Pediatric neurologists, genetic specialists flown in from California, a developmental consultant from Massachusetts who charged $4,000 an hour and left with no answers. Every test came back clean, perfect brain function, strong reflexes, normal hormone levels, healthy in every way that medicine knew how to measure. But touch that baby, any human being on earth, it did not matter who, and he lost his mind. The room smelled like eucalyptus oil and fresh linen and money. Everything in it was the finest version of itself. The crib had been custom built in Vermont. The monitoring equipment was the same used in the top NICU facilities in the country. The windows looked out over the Hudson River, and even through the glass you could see the grey water moving slow and steady in the early morning light. None of it helped. Demarion turned away from the crib and walked to the window. He pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and stared at the river. Behind him, the baby's crying began to fade, not because anyone had fixed anything, but because his son had simply exhausted himself again. That was always how it ended. The child cried until he had nothing left. Then he slept. Then he woke up. And the moment someone reached for him, the whole thing started over. 6 weeks of that cycle, 6 weeks and counting. One of the nurses spoke quietly from behind him. She told him the morning feeding was complete. She told him the vitals were stable. She told him, very carefully, in the tone people use when they are delivering news they are afraid of, that the lead consultant wanted to schedule another round of assessments. Demarion did not turn around. He said, "Get me someone who actually has an answer." The nurse left. The room went quiet, except for the soft sound of the baby breathing. Demarion stared at the river. Somewhere out there, in the water and the fog and the first pale light of morning, were 3 of his cargo ships moving tonnage through the harbor on a schedule his operations team had perfected down to 18-minute intervals. His ports in Maryland were processing 50 containers an hour. His clean energy subsidiary in Alaska had just broken ground on a site that would generate returns for 30 years. Everything he had ever built worked exactly the way he designed it to work. Except the one thing he had not designed, the one thing he could not engineer or negotiate or control, his son. And somewhere on the upper floors of that same building, 2 floors above where Demarion was standing, a man named Ezra Osei was awake. He had been awake since the first cry reached him through the ceiling. He was 7 months pregnant. He was sitting on the edge of a bed in the dark, with one hand pressed against his belly, listening. And the look on his face was not one of sympathy. It was recognition. Like he understood something about that cry that nobody in that nursery had been able to figure out in 6 weeks. He stood up slowly, he put on his shoes, and he walked toward the door, moving in the exact direction he had been told, very clearly, never to go. Ezra Osei did not knock, and he pushed through the nursery door at 6:47 in the morning with his cotton sweater wrinkled from sleep, his shoes only half tied, and his 7-month belly leading the way. 2 nurses spun around. The security alpha stationed by the window straightened up fast. The pediatric consultant at the monitoring station dropped his pen. And Demarion turned from the window with a look on his face that could have stopped traffic on the bridge outside. "You're not supposed to be on this floor," Demarion said. His voice was controlled. Flat. The kind of flat that meant he was working hard to keep it that way. Ezra didn't answer. He walked straight to the crib. The baby, Demarion's son, 6 weeks old, the child that had screamed at every living person who had ever tried to touch him, was lying on his back, or chest heaving from the last round of crying, fists curled tight, eyes moving fast, like he was still waiting for the next threat to arrive. Ezra stopped at the rail. He didn't reach in. He didn't make sounds. He didn't try to soothe with words. He just stood there, both hands resting on the crib rail, and breathed out slow. Long, the way a person breathes when they have consciously decided to release every single thing they are holding. The room changed. It didn't change the way a light switch changes a room. It changed the way weather changes, gradual, total, something in the air shifting its weight. The temperature felt the same. Nothing looked different. But everyone in that room felt it happen, and not one of them could have explained what it was. The baby's fists uncurled. Demarion went completely still. Ezra reached one finger into the crib. No grabbing, no lifting. Just one finger extended, resting near the baby's open hand. The baby turned toward it, and the room went silent. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had pressed a button nobody knew existed. The baby's fingers wrapped around Ezra's index finger and held on. His chest slowed. His eyes stopped moving. Every bit of tension drained out of that tiny body so fast that 2 of the nurses actually stepped forward, afraid something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. That was the problem. Because the look on that baby's face, the complete and total calm, the stillness of a child who had finally found the one thing he had been screaming for, was the most normal thing that had happened in that room in 6 weeks. And it had come from the one person nobody had thought to put in it. Demarion stared at his son. He stared at the small fingers wrapped around Ezra's hand. He looked at the rise and fall of the baby's chest, slow and even now, the way it should have been from the very first day. And something moved through him that was not a feeling he had a word for. It was deeper than confusion. It was the specific discomfort of a man who is very good at being right, realizing that he has been wrong about something that mattered. "How?" Demarion said. It came out low, almost quiet. Ezra looked at him across the top of the crib. His face was steady, calm, not the kind of calm that performs itself, the kind that simply exists in people who have stopped pretending that things are fine when they are not. "He's not rejecting touch," Ezra said. "He's rejecting dominance." The word landed hard in that room. Dominance. Demarion's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. Ezra looked back down at the baby. Every person who has come through that door came in leading with control. It's in the air before you say a word. Every alpha in this room, you included, your body tells this space you own it. He feels that before he feels anything else. And he's been screaming at it. Nobody spoke. Demarion looked at the nurses. He looked at the security guard. He looked at the consultant standing at the monitoring station who had been in the room for 4 days and had said exactly nothing useful. And he understood, for the first time, that they had all been solving the wrong problem. They thought the baby was broken. The baby had been telling them the truth the whole time. Before Demarion could say a single word, before he could ask the question that was already forming, the one that started with "what do we do now?" and ended somewhere he wasn't ready to go, the doors at the far end of the corridor banged open. Hard, loud, the kind of entry that announces itself before the person does. And every alpha in that room turned at the same time. Caius Remington walked in like he owned the building. Tailored dark suit, ice-cold expression. The kind of posture that comes from decades of walking into rooms and watching everyone else adjust. He was one of Demarion's rivals, had been for 7 years, and the two of them operated in the same industry the way two storms operate in the same coastline. Eventually, one of them takes the whole shore. Caius stopped in the middle of the corridor, looked through the open nursery door, and smiled. Oh, it was not a warm smile. "Demarion Calloway," he said, "I heard you had a situation." Demarion stepped out of the nursery and pulled the door closed behind him. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he wants the other person to understand that whatever is about to happen will happen on his terms. "You're 2 buildings away from anywhere I invited you," Demarion said. Caius raised both hands, palms open, a gesture of theater. "Relax, I'm not armed." He looked at the closed nursery door. "I just wanted to see it for myself. 6 weeks, and not one person on your entire payroll can figure out why the heir to the Calloway empire won't let himself be touched." He paused. "Let that sit. That's a particular kind of problem. You have 5 seconds to turn around." Caius didn't move. "I'm hearing things, Demarion. And investors are hearing things. People who write checks with a lot of zeros are starting to ask questions about succession, about whether a child who rejects his own father is really the kind of foundation you want to build the next generation of this company on." The hallway was very quiet. Demarion took 1 step forward. Caius took none back, but his body registered the step. A small adjustment in weight, a tightening across the shoulders. He was good at performing confidence, but performance and the real thing feel different in a hallway at 6 in the morning when the person across from you has not slept. "What happened to your deal in Texas?" Demarion asked. His voice was quiet, conversational almost. "The acquisition that was supposed to close in September." Caius said nothing. "Or the Maryland freight contracts. The 3 you lost in October." Demarion tilted his head slightly. "Or are we not talking about you right now?" The temperature in the hallway dropped. Caius straightened his jacket. His jaw moved once. "I came as a courtesy." "You came to see if the rumor was true." Demarion walked back to the nursery door and put his hand on the frame. "It's not. Go home." Caius looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the door. Then he left. His footsteps on the marble floor were the only sound until the elevator closed. Demarion stood in the doorway and looked back into the room. Ezra was still at the crib, still holding his finger inside the rail. The baby was still asleep. The nurses were standing quietly at the edges of the room, watching both of them the way people watch something they don't fully understand but know they are witnessing. Demarion walked back in. He stood on the opposite side of the crib from Ezra. He looked down at his son, the small chest rising and falling, the fingers still curled around Ezra's, the face relaxed in a way Demarion had never seen in daylight, only in the brief windows between crying and exhaustion. "What does he need?" Demarion said. Not a question. More like a man reading a sentence out loud that he already knows the answer to and doesn't want to say. Ezra answered anyway. "He needs safety," Ezra said, "not protection. There's a difference." Demarion looked up. "Protection is the armed guard outside the door," Ezra said. "Safety is what a baby feels when the air around him tells him that nobody in the room is at war." The words moved through Demarion like cold water, because he understood exactly what that meant. And he had built an empire on war. Not the visible kind, no weapons, no public violence, nothing that left marks, but the constant pressure of dominance, of being the alpha in every room, of making sure that every person around him always understood the hierarchy. That was the air his son had been breathing since the first minute of his life, and his son had been screaming about it ever since. Demarion looked at Ezra for a long time without saying anything. Ezra looked back without flinching, and right there, in that quiet room with the sleeping baby between them and the Hudson River grey in the early morning outside the window, something shifted between those two men. Something that neither one of them had language for yet. Something that was going to change everything before either of them was ready. That night, Demarion got a phone call. He listened for 40 seconds, didn't speak, ended the call, and sat in the dark of his office on the other side of the penthouse for a long time afterward, completely still. Because the caller told him that Caius Remington had not come to the hospital alone that morning. He had brought someone with him, and that someone had been watching Ezra. By noon the same day, the surveillance footage confirmed it. A man, standing at the far end of the hospital corridor, half hidden behind the maintenance door at 6:51 in the morning. 4 minutes after Caius had arrived, gone before security finished their sweep. No ID, no visitor badge, no reason to be on that floor. But he had been there, and he had been watching Ezra's back the entire time Ezra stood at the crib. Demarion pulled up the still frame on the monitor in his office. He studied the angle of the man's body, the way his attention was pointed, deliberate, patient, not like someone who wandered into the wrong hallway, like someone who had been sent to confirm a specific piece of information. He forwarded the image to his head of security, a man named Quentin Graves, who had been in this industry longer than Demarion and who responded to uncertainty the way most people respond to a light switch, with immediate, decisive action. Quentin called back in 11 minutes. He said 3 things. The first thing was that the man in the photo was a known associate of Caius Remington's operation. Second tier, the kind of person who runs errands that don't need to be traceable. The second thing was that Caius had been making quiet inquiries, through 2 different intermediaries, into Ezra Osei's specific legal history. The trafficking case, the federal referral, the evidence chain. The third thing was the one that made Demarion stand up from his chair. The evidence that Ezra had been building, the full case documentation, the financial records, the witness statements, was not fully submitted. Parts of it were still in Ezra's possession, still being organized, still weeks away from being airtight enough to submit without risk of challenge. And Caius Remington now knew that. Demarion was already moving toward the elevator before Quentin finished the sentence. Ezra was in the penthouse study when Demarion came in. He was sitting at the long wooden desk with papers spread in front of him. Legal briefs, printed case files, and a laptop open to a document filled with numbered footnotes. He had a cup of tea going cold at his elbow and the specific focused stillness of someone who had spent years learning how to work in the middle of danger without letting the danger inside the work. He looked up when Demarion walked in. He read the expression on Demarion's face immediately. "What happened?" Ezra said. Not alarmed. Steady. The tone of someone who has received bad news before and learned how to meet it standing, Demarion told him. All of it. The man in the corridor, the inquiries, the case documentation. He laid it out in order, without editorializing, the way someone delivers information when the other person is smart enough to draw their own conclusions. Ezra listened without interrupting. When Demarion finished, Ezra was quiet for a long moment, and he looked at the papers on the desk. His hand moved slowly to rest on his belly, a gesture that had become natural to him over the last 7 months, unconscious, the way a person reaches for the thing they are most responsible for when the world reminds them what is at stake. "He's not after the case," Ezra said quietly. Demarion waited. He already lost the case. He knows that. What he's after is the window. Ezra looked up. "If he can get to the documentation before I submit it, delay it, compromise it, make it legally challengeable, then the federal referral loses its teeth. The charges get reduced, maybe dropped entirely." He paused. "He's not trying to destroy the case, he's trying to buy time." Demarion looked at him. "How close are you?" Demarion said. 3 weeks, Ezra said. "Maybe 2 if I work straight through." "Then work straight through." The words came out harder than Demarion meant them to. Not cold, just the way a man sounds when he has already decided what needs to happen and is moving toward it. Ezra didn't flinch. He held Demarion's gaze with the calm confidence of someone who had been making hard decisions alone for long enough that other people's urgency no longer rushed him. "I don't need to be told what the stakes are," Ezra said. "I built this case from nothing. I know every line of it." Silence stretched between them. Then Ezra said quietly, "But you should know, Caius isn't the only one who's been asking about me." Demarion's eyes sharpened. "Someone else," Ezra said. "Different channel, not connected to Caius." He turned back to the papers. "I don't know who yet." Demarion stood in the doorway of that study for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back out. In the nursery, 2 floors below, the baby began to cry. Soft at first, then building. the old familiar sound rising through the ceiling like a signal nobody had learned to read correctly until this morning. But Ezra was already at the desk, working. And that night, Demarion pulled resources off 2 other operations and redirected them to one job: find out who the second person was. He had the answer by morning, and it was worse than he expected. The name was Terence Voss. Demarion sat with that name for a long time before he said it out loud. Terence Voss was not a rival, not a competitor, and not someone who operated in the shipping lanes or the energy corridors or anywhere near the industry Demarion had spent 15 years building. Terence Voss was a federal contractor, a man who moved between private consulting and government-adjacent work, and whose name appeared in exactly the kind of documents that never get filed publicly. He was the person you called when you needed something done quietly, at a level where normal power did not reach. And he had been making inquiries about Ezra Osei for 11 days. Demarion put that information in order. Caius Remington looking into the case documents. Terence Voss looking into Ezra personally. 2 separate threads from 2 separate directions, arriving at the same person at the same time. That was not coincidence. That was a plan. He called Quinton Graves at 4 in the morning, and he gave him one instruction. He said, "Find the connection." Then he went to the nursery. The baby, his son, Malik, he had decided on the name 3 days prior but had not told anyone yet, was awake. Not crying. Just awake. Eyes open, tracking the ceiling, doing the slow, serious work of being a 6-week-old in a world that so far had not made a great deal of sense. Demarion pulled a chair to the side of the crib and sat down. He did not reach in. He had tried that. He knew how it ended. He just sat. Elbows on his knees, hands loose. The way Ezra had stood that morning, not leading with anything, not filling the air with authority, just existing beside the crib without making it about himself. Malik's eyes moved to him. They stayed there, not with fear, and not with the pre-cry tension that had been on that baby's face for 6 weeks every time Demarion got close. Just looking. The careful, unrushed attention of a child taking inventory of the person across from him. Demarion held still. He did not know how long they stayed like that, long enough that the light through the window changed slightly, long enough that one of the nurses looked through the glass in the door and then very deliberately did not come in. Then Malik's face tightened, small, fast, the way weather changes in the moments before it breaks. Demarion felt it, the shift in his own body, the automatic response he hadn't even been aware of until now. The moment the outside threat entered his mind, Terence Voss, Caius, the plan he couldn't fully see yet, his whole system tightened, his posture changed, and the air around him changed, and his son felt it before Demarion had moved a single muscle. He understood then what Ezra meant. It wasn't about what Demarion did. It was about what he carried. The moment danger entered his mind, his body became the danger, and a child wired to read that signal had no choice but to respond. Malik started to cry. Demarion stood up slowly. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back once at his son, who was crying now with the full commitment of a child who has no other language for what he knows. Something locked into place in Demarion's chest. A decision. Not a business decision. Not a strategy. Something older than that. He had to change something that had never been changed before. Something that had been built into him so deep that he had never once thought of it as a choice. It was just how he existed in the world, how every alpha he had ever known existed. And changing it, actually changing it, would require him to give up something that his entire identity was constructed on top of. He left the nursery. He went to the study. He knocked on the open door. Ezra looked up from the desk. It was almost 5 in the morning. He had clearly not slept. The papers were reorganized. The laptop had 4 documents open. The cold cup of tea had been replaced with a new one, also going cold. Demarion leaned against the doorframe. "I need to understand something," he said. "Completely, all of it. The biology, the instinct, what he's reading and why." He paused. "I need you to teach me what I don't know." Ezra looked at him for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair beside the desk. Demarion sat down, and outside, somewhere in the city, Terence Voss made a phone call. Nobody intercepted it. Nobody knew about it until 3 days later, when Quinton Graves traced the number to a blocked line that routed through 2 cities before it landed on a name that made Demarion go very quiet. Because the name on the other end of that call was someone inside Demarion's own organization. The name was Broderick Wynne. Quinton Graves put the file on Demarion's desk at 7 in the morning and stepped back without saying a word. Because there was nothing to say that the file didn't already say louder. Broderick Wynne, 43 years old, Senior Logistics Coordinator for the Calloway Group's Eastern Operations. 11 years with the company, the kind of employee who knew every port schedule, every cargo manifest, every route deviation, every contract negotiation that had happened in the last decade. The kind of man who sat in rooms where sensitive things were decided and was trusted precisely because he had never once given anyone a reason not to trust him. 11 years. And he had been feeding information to Terence Voss for the last 4 months. Demarion read the file standing up. He didn't sit. He didn't react visibly. He read every page the way he read every difficult thing, completely, carefully, without rushing to the part where he was supposed to feel something. Then he closed it. He looked at Quinton. "How deep does it go?" Quinton said, "Deep enough that Cries has your Q3 routing strategy. Deep enough that the Maryland renegotiation terms were known before you sat down at the table." He paused. "Deep enough that Voss knew Ezra was in this building before the first threat came in." The room went very quiet. Demarion walked to the window. Outside, the city was awake and moving, indifferent to everything happening 14 floors above it. Cars, people, the river carrying its slow, steady weight toward the harbor. He thought about the last 4 months. Every meeting where Broderick had been present, every decision that had landed wrong in ways that seemed like bad luck at the time, the Texas acquisition that fell apart at the final hour, the Maryland contractor who walked away from a deal that should have been closed, and the 2 board members who had received what they described as industry intelligence about Demarion's succession concerns. None of it had been bad luck. All of it had been Broderick Wynne sitting in the corner of a room, listening and reporting back. "Find out everything he's passed to Voss," Demarion said. "Every communication, every document. I want to know exactly what Caius has before I decide what to do about it." Quinton left. Demarion stayed at the window for 2 more minutes. Then he went to the nursery. Ezra was already there. He had been coming every morning since the first time, not because anyone had asked him to, but because Malik had made it clear, in the only language available to a 6-week-old, that Ezra's presence was not optional. The baby tracked him the moment he walked in, settled within 60 seconds. I'd slept longer, ate better, stayed calm through the parts of the day that had previously been the hardest. The nurses had stopped questioning it after day 3. Demarion stood in the doorway and watched. Ezra was at the crib, one hand resting on the rail, not even touching Malik directly. Just being there. The room was warm and quiet and completely different from what it had been a week ago. Ezra looked up. He read Demarion's face the way he had been reading it all week, fast, accurately, without making it obvious. "Bad news," Ezra said. Not a question. "Internal," Demarion said. Ezra absorbed that without flinching. He turned back to Malik, who was watching his father from the crib with the focused attention that had replaced the constant crying. Then Ezra said, "How long?" 4 months minimum. Ezra was quiet for a moment. "Then everything Caius moved against you in that window was built on what he heard from inside." "Yes." "So he doesn't actually have leverage," Ezra said. "He has stolen information. Which means if you move now, if you plug the source and counter everything Voss passed before it can be used, Caius is operating blind from this point forward." Demarion looked at him. Ezra looked back. "Plug the source, quietly, then let him make his next move on information he thinks is current, but isn't." It was exactly what Demarion had already been thinking. That was starting to happen more often. He would arrive at a conclusion, and Ezra would already be standing in it. He did not know what to do with that yet. He left the nursery, he called 2 people, he gave 2 instructions. By noon, and Broderick Wynne had been quietly removed from every system that mattered and replaced with a man named Chauncey Ellard, who Quinton had vetted personally and who had no connection to anything outside the Calloway Group. By evening, false routing information, clean, convincing, completely useless, was flowing through every channel Broderick had been using. Caius Remington would receive it within 48 hours. He would believe it, and he would build his next move on a foundation that did not exist. Demarion ate dinner alone in his office that night. He had 3 reports open on his desk and a glass of water he hadn't touched. Somewhere in the building, Malik was sleeping. Somewhere 2 floors above, Ezra was still working on the case documentation, pushing toward the 2-week finish line he had set for himself. Everything was moving. And the problem was Demarion could feel something else moving too. Something he couldn't put his finger on yet. A pressure in the shape of things. The way a room feels right before the temperature drops. His phone rang at 11:47. It was Quinton again. He said 4 words before Demarion could speak. Ezra's file was copied. Not the legal documents, not the case files, the personal file. The one that contained Ezra's medical records, his pregnancy history, his location before Demarion's protection, the names of 2 people who had helped him build the trafficking case and whose identities had never been made public. Copied. From inside the building's own secure server. Accessed through a credentials set that belonged to a staff member on the medical team. A credentials set that had been used only once. At 2:17 in the morning, 6 days ago. 6 days ago. Demarion stared at the report, the timestamp, the access log, the specific files pulled. He set the paper down flat on his desk and pressed his palm against it. 6 days ago, he had believed the Broderick Wynne situation was the full picture. It was not the full picture. There were 2 separate operations running against Ezra. Caius working through Broderick for business intelligence. And now something else, something that had gone for Ezra's personal information, his physical history, his pre-protection location data, moving through the medical side of the building on a timeline that predated the Broderick discovery by weeks. These were not the same operation. Demarion stood up. He walked to Ezra's floor. He knocked once and opened the door. Ezra was asleep at the desk, and a head resting on his folded arms, the laptop still open and glowing in front of him. Papers everywhere, the cold tea, the careful, exhausted work of a man running on determination and deadline. Demarion stood in the doorway for a moment. He walked in quietly. He moved the laptop to the side, carefully, without closing it. He took the blanket from the back of the couch and put it over Ezra's shoulders without touching him, just draping it close. Then he sat down in the chair across the desk and waited for morning. When Ezra woke up 40 minutes later, that specific abrupt awareness of someone who has learned not to sleep deeply, he found Demarion sitting across from him in the dark. Still, awake, watching the door. Ezra did not startle. He looked at Demarion. He looked at the blanket. Then he said quietly, "What happened?" Demarion told him about the copied file, the medical credentials, the personal data, the timeline. Ezra listened without moving. When Demarion finished, Ezra was silent for a long moment. His hand moved to his belly, that unconscious reach, the one that happened every time the world reminded him what was at stake. "They're not after the case," Ezra said. "This group isn't. They pulled location data, pre-protection location." He looked up. "Someone wants to know where I was before I came here." Demarion kept his voice level. "Why?" Ezra looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since Demarion had known him, something moved across his face that was not calm. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. The specific expression of a person who has been running ahead of a threat for so long that they had almost convinced themselves they had outrun it, and just heard footsteps again. "Because not everyone I documented in that trafficking case has been arrested yet," Ezra said. The room went very still. "There are 3 names in the full case file that haven't been publicly connected to the network," Ezra continued. His voice was steady again. He was making it steady, which is different. High level, the kind of people whose exposure ends careers and opens federal investigations that go far beyond what I've already filed. He paused. "Those 3 names, if they know I have them, they won't come after the case. They'll come after me." Demarion's jaw set. "And the baby," Ezra said quietly. "Anyone tracking my location history and medical file knows I'm 7 months pregnant, which means they know I'm not going anywhere fast." The silence after that sentence was one of the hardest silences Demarion had ever sat in. He looked at Ezra across the desk, at the papers, at the laptop still open with its careful, important work, at the man who had walked into a nursery at 6:47 in the morning and fixed something that an entire team of specialists had failed to fix, not because he had tools no one else had, but because he had paid attention when no one else had been willing to. Demarion said, "No one comes through this building without going through me." "I know that," Ezra said. "Then let me work." "I'm not stopping you," Ezra said, and then quieter, "But Demarion, this isn't something you can solve by controlling the perimeter. The people with those 3 names, they have resources that don't care about your perimeter." Demarion looked at him. "Finish the case," Ezra said. "That's the only thing that actually makes this stop. The moment those names are on file with the federal system, I become less useful as a target. The information is already out. There's nothing left to protect by coming after me." Demarion understood the logic. He also understood that between now and the moment that filing was complete, Ezra was sitting in the exact center of a target that was getting smaller and more specific every day. He left the study. He went to Quinton. He said one thing: round the clock, 2-man rotation, nobody on Ezra's floor without direct authorization from him. Quinton said yes and started moving. 3 days passed. The filing got closer. Ezra did not sleep more than 4 hours at a stretch. He worked with the steady, locked-in focus of someone who knows that speed matters more than comfort right now. He was thorough. He was precise. He was 1 week away. On the 4th morning, Malik was having a hard day. Not the old screaming. That had not come back since the first morning Ezra had stood at the crib. But a restless, unsettled energy, the kind that moved through the baby like a current he couldn't name. The nurses reported he had been awake since 3. Not crying, just awake, alert, like he was listening for something. Ezra came down and sat beside the crib. Malik calmed within 5 minutes. Demarion came in 20 minutes after that. He sat on the opposite side. The 3 of them stayed like that, the baby between them, the city outside, the morning light moving slow across the floor, for almost an hour. Nobody said anything. It was the most honest hour Demarion had spent in that building in a long time. And then Quinton knocked on the glass outside the nursery door. One knock, hard, the kind that means now. Demarion stood up. He went to the door. Quinton held up his phone. On the screen was a surveillance image, grainy, time-stamped from 40 minutes ago. Terence Voss, standing outside the building, on the sidewalk. In daylight, not hiding, just standing there, looking up. Terence Voss did not come inside. He stood on that sidewalk for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Demarion knew because Quinton had the timestamp down to the second. And then he walked north and disappeared into the morning foot traffic like he had never been there at all. 6 minutes and 40 seconds of standing in plain sight, looking at a building he had been working against from the shadows for weeks. That was a message, not a threat, not a move. A message. The specific kind that says, "I know exactly where you are, and I am not afraid of you knowing that I know." Demarion stood in the security office with his arms crossed and watched the footage 3 times. Then he did something that surprised even Quinton. He said, "Don't move on him." Quinton turned slowly. He was standing outside the building. "I know. He's the one who accessed Ezra's file. I know that too." Demarion looked at the frozen image on the screen. "If we move on Voss right now, whoever is above him goes quiet and we lose the trail. Voss is not the top. He is a step." He turned away from the monitor. "We let him think the message landed. We let him think we're rattled, and we wait for him to move to the next step." Quinton held his expression steady, which was how Demarion knew he did not fully agree. 2 days, Demarion said. "Give me 2 days." Quinton gave him the 2 days. What happened in those 2 days changed the entire shape of the situation. The first thing that happened was Ezra finished the case filing. Not the full submission, that required one final review by a federal contact he had been communicating with through secure channels, but the core documentation. Every financial record, every communication intercept, every witness statement, every name, including the 3 high-level names that nobody had connected to the network publicly yet. He walked into Demarion's office at 9 at night and put a single printed summary on the desk. "It's done," he said. "The formal submission goes in 72 hours." Demarion looked at the summary. He looked at Ezra. Something moved through him. Not relief, not yet, because 72 hours was still 72 hours, but something close to it. The specific feeling of watching a long, grinding effort arrive at its final stage. "You should sleep," Demarion said. "I'll sleep in 73 hours, Ezra said. He turned and walked back toward the study. Demarion watched him go. He sat with the summary in front of him for a long time. The second thing that happened was Malik said his first sound. It was not a word. He was 6 weeks old. It was not supposed to be a word. But in the middle of a quiet afternoon in the nursery, I'm with Ezra sitting beside the crib and Demarion across from him, Malik made a sound that was not crying and not fussing. A soft, deliberate sound, low and rounded and aimed at the two people in the room. Everyone froze. Malik made the sound again, and then he reached his arms up. Not toward Ezra, not toward one of the nurses. Up, in the direction of both of them. Arms raised, fingers open, the universal signal of a small person who has decided they are ready to be held. The nurse looked at Demarion. Demarion looked at Ezra. Ezra looked at the baby. Demarion stood up slowly. He moved to the crib. He reached in, slowly, no authority in it, no dominance, just his hands open and careful and honest, and lifted his son for the first time in 6 weeks without his son screaming. Malik looked up at him. Demarion held still. He held his breath. Malik's face did not tighten, did not tremble. He looked at his father with the full, serious attention of a child who has decided, after careful and thorough consideration, that this person is safe. Demarion exhaled, and in 6 weeks of that building, that was the most important breath he had taken. But the third thing that happened erased the warmth of that moment before the day was over. Caius Remington filed an injunction, not against Demarion, against Ezra. A legal motion filed through a proxy firm in Washington challenging the authority of Ezra's federal filing on the grounds that evidence had been improperly obtained. It was thin. Any decent attorney would tear it apart. But thin didn't matter. Thin was designed to take time, and time was the one resource Caius needed to buy before that submission went through. 72 hours became a countdown, not a safe one. Demarion read the injunction filing at his desk. He set it down. He picked up his phone. He called one person. Someone he had not called in 3 years. A federal contact whose name did not appear in any of his business files, whose connection to him existed entirely off the record, whose ability to accelerate a review process when the situation was legitimate and urgent was the kind of resource you kept in reserve for exactly this kind of moment. The call lasted 4 minutes. Afterward, Demarion sat in the quiet of his office and listened to the building around him. Somewhere above, Ezra working. Somewhere below, Malik sleeping. Somewhere outside, Terence Voss waiting for his next instruction. And somewhere in the legal machinery of a federal system that did not move fast for anyone. A clock, now running. Toward a submission, toward a resolution, toward the moment when all of this would either end cleanly or break wide open. 36 hours. That was how long Demarion had. And at hour 34, Ezra went into labor. The contractions started at 4 in the morning. Ezra was at the desk when it happened. He registered the first one the way a person registers something they have been half expecting, with a long, controlled breath and a very deliberate decision not to panic. He finished the paragraph he was writing. Then he stood up, walked to the door, and said to the security rotation in the hallway, "I need a car." Demarion was in the vehicle before Ezra had reached the lobby. He did not ask questions in the car, and he sat beside Ezra in the back seat and watched the city move past the windows and let the silence be what it was. Ezra was managing the contractions the way he managed everything, internally, precisely, without performance. His hands stayed flat on his thighs. His breathing stayed even. He looked straight ahead. Once a contraction pulled harder than the others, and his jaw tightened and his eyes closed for 3 seconds. Demarion's hand moved across the seat. He stopped it just short of Ezra's arm. Ezra opened his eyes. He looked at Demarion's hand, hovering there, uncertain. And then he moved his own hand and covered it. Neither of them said anything. The hospital was awake in the way hospitals are always awake, quietly urgent, the halls lit and moving while the city outside still slept. The private ward had been briefed. The attending physician met them at the elevator. By 6:30 in the morning, it was confirmed, false labor. The contractions had stabilized, no dilation. The baby was not coming today. But the stress levels were too high. The doctor said it plainly and without apology. If Ezra did not reduce his workload, stop the late nights, stop running on 4 hours of sleep and cold tea and pressure, the next episode would not be false. Ezra lay in the hospital bed and looked at the ceiling. Demarion sat in the chair beside the bed. Not at the foot, beside, at the level of Ezra's shoulder. 12 hours, Ezra said. What? That's how long it will take me to finish the final review. Give me 12 uninterrupted hours, and I can file before anything else moves. Demarion looked at him. The doctor just told you. I heard what he said. Ezra turned his head. His eyes were steady. Tired, genuinely deeply tired, but steady. And I'm telling you that I have spent 3 years on this case. I have been threatened, relocated, and had my personal file stolen. I have been 7 months pregnant and working at a desk at 2 in the morning because the alternative is letting people who destroyed lives walk free on a procedural delay. He paused. 12 hours. Then I sleep. I promise. Demarion looked at him for a long time. Then he called his own physician. He arranged for a portable monitoring unit to be set up in the study. He arranged for a nurse to be stationed on that floor for the full 12 hours. He arranged for meals to arrive every 3 hours, whether Ezra asked for them or not. Then he went 2 floors down. Malik was awake. The morning nurse was doing the standard check. Malik saw Demarion come in and did the thing he had started doing 3 days ago. Arms up, fingers open, that deliberate reach. Demarion picked him up. No screaming, no trembling. Just his son in his arms, warm and solid and real, looking at him with those serious eyes. He walked to the window with Malik against his chest and stood there while the city came all the way awake outside. He thought about the last 6 weeks, about the nursery full of specialists and the baby who had screamed at all of them, about a door pushed open at 6:47 in the morning by a man in a wrinkled sweater who had not been invited and had not cared, about what it cost to build an empire that a child was afraid of, about what it cost to change. At noon, Quinton called. The injunction had been challenged. The federal contact had moved. A supervising attorney had reviewed the filing and agreed it lacked sufficient grounds to delay submission. The 72-hour window had been reduced to 6. Ezra had been working for 5.5 hours. Demarion walked to the study door. He looked through the glass. Ezra was at the desk, head down, hand moving across the final pages of the review. The monitoring unit beeped steady and normal beside him. The nurse sat quietly in the corner. Demarion did not go in. He stood at the door and watched. 40 minutes later, Ezra looked up from the desk. He caught Demarion's eyes through the glass. He nodded once. Demarion pushed the door open. Done? He said. Done, Ezra said. He sent the submission at 12:51 in the afternoon. And then he put his head down on the desk and was asleep in under 2 minutes. Demarion stood in the doorway of that study for a long time. Then, quietly, he pulled the door almost closed and went back to his son. He did not know what the next hours would bring. The submission was in. The 3 names were now on file. Caius's injunction was collapsing. Terence Voss had gone quiet in a way that Quinton said felt like retreat. But still, he had been in enough situations to know that the moment right before resolution is the most dangerous moment of all. When a cornered person has nothing left to lose and enough information to cause damage on the way out. He held Malik against his chest and waited. Caius Remington was arrested on a Wednesday, not dramatically, not in public, and he was taken from a private parking structure in Midtown Manhattan at 2:15 in the afternoon by 4 federal agents in plain clothes who had been waiting on confirmation from the submission Ezra filed the previous day. The 3 high-level names in that filing had produced an immediate review that expanded the existing investigation and connected Caius to financial transactions he had been running parallel to the trafficking network for 18 months. Terence Voss surrendered the following morning. His attorney contacted the federal office at 9. By noon, Voss had agreed to a proffer session in exchange for cooperation on the higher-level charges. The two individuals above him in the network, the ones whose names nobody had known until Ezra's filing made them visible, were indicted by end of week. 11 years of work, 3 years of Ezra's, thousands of hours, 2 relocations, 6 weeks of a baby screaming in a hospital room that didn't understand what he was hearing. And then it was over, not with a bang. With paperwork and a phone call and a Tuesday afternoon that looked like every other Tuesday afternoon from the outside. Demarion got the call from his federal contact at 3 in the afternoon. He was in the nursery with Malik, who was developing the new habit of reaching for Demarion's collar with both hands and holding on. Not afraid, holding on the way a person holds something they have decided is theirs. Demarion listened to the call, said thank you, ended it. He looked down at his son. Malik looked back at him. Demarion said quietly, to no one in particular, "It's done." He went to Ezra's floor. Ezra was awake, had been awake for 6 hours. The first full night of sleep he had taken in 2 weeks behind him, and was standing at the window of the study with a cup of tea that was, for once, still warm. He looked rested in the way people look when rest is new and their body hasn't fully trusted it yet. He turned when Demarion came in. Demarion said, "It's over." Ezra looked at him. Something moved across his face. Not the explosion of relief that movies show, but something quieter. Something that happens in a person's body when a tension they have been carrying for so long it became invisible finally releases. His shoulders dropped half an inch, his eyes closed for 1 second. When he opened them, they were bright. He did not cry. That was not the kind of man he was. But he turned back to the window, and the city outside was the same city it had always been. And somehow it looked completely different now. Demarion stayed in the doorway. He thought about everything that had happened in the last 6 weeks. About a baby who had screamed at the world and been right about every single thing he was screaming about. About a man who had walked through a door he was told not to walk through and changed the entire direction of things by simply showing up and being honest. About the version of himself that had existed before all of this. The alpha who walked into rooms and owned the air, who built empires on the principle of control, who had never once considered that the thing he was building might be exactly what his child was afraid of. He had changed. He knew he had changed. Not completely, not permanently in every situation. A change like that is slow, and it requires maintenance, and it does not arrive in one morning beside a crib. But something real had shifted. Something structural. He had learned how to sit beside his son without filling the room with his own need to dominate it. He had learned how to hold his body differently when threat arrived, to receive it instead of projecting back against it. He had learned that power and safety are not the same thing, and that building one without the other is building something his own child will spend his whole life trying to escape. Malik had taught him that, at 6 weeks old, through nothing but honesty. Ezra turned from the window. He looked at Demarion standing in the doorway. "You're going to stand there, or you're going to come in," Ezra said. Demarion came in. He sat down in the chair across from the desk, the same chair he had sat in at 4 in the morning 2 weeks ago, watching the door while Ezra slept. The room felt different now. The papers were gone. The laptop was closed. The cold cups of tea had been cleared away. It looked like a room that had finished something. They sat there for a while without talking. Outside, the sun was moving toward the afternoon in the way it does in autumn in New York, low and gold, and giving everything it lights an edge that seems specific, like the city is deciding what to keep. Ezra's hand moved to his belly. That reach, that unconscious, constant reach toward the child he was still carrying. "What happens now?" Demarion said. Ezra looked at him. "You mean with the company, or with us?" The word us moved through the room and settled. Demarion looked at him steadily. "Both," he said. Ezra was quiet for a moment. Then, "The company rebuilds on what you've already started. The aggressive positions that were costing you more than they were making you, you let them go. The Maryland contracts tied to networks you knew were wrong. You don't go back to those. The empire survives. It just becomes something your children can actually inherit without it damaging them." Demarion nodded. And us. Ezra looked at him. I don't know yet, Ezra said, honest, direct, the way he said every true thing. I know what I've watched you become in 6 weeks. I know what it took and what it cost you. I know that a man who sits in a chair in the dark at 4 in the morning to watch the door while someone he is responsible for sleeps. I know what kind of man does that. He paused. But I also know that I am 7.5 months pregnant, and I have been running on 3 years of crisis mode, and I need things to slow down before I can tell what is real and what is just the aftermath of surviving something. Demarion looked at him. That's fair, he said. Ezra looked slightly surprised, like he had expected an argument. Demarion almost smiled. Almost. 3 weeks later, Ezra's son was born at 5:42 in the morning in the same private hospital, in a room where the lights were kept low and the machines beeped steady and the rain outside moved across the windows in long, slow sheets. He was healthy, strong, full of sound the moment he arrived, the good kind, the demanding kind, the kind that says I am here and I intend to be heard. Demarion was in the room. He did not have to be asked. When Ezra was resting and the baby had been cleaned and checked and wrapped, the nurse brought the newborn to Demarion first, at Ezra's instruction, the same way Ezra had instructed everything else, quietly, specifically, with the full weight of intention behind it. Demarion held the child, and the child looked up at him with Ezra's eyes, dark and steady and already taking inventory of the world he had arrived in. Demarion held him like he had learned to hold Malik. Open hands, no need to prove anything, no authority filling the air, just a man holding a child and being, for once, exactly what that child needed him to be. Later that same morning, both boys were in the nursery together. Malik, 6 weeks older. I noticed the new arrival with the concentrated attention of a child who has decided that everything in this room is his responsibility. He turned on his side. He reached toward his brother. And the room was quiet in a way that rooms are quiet when everything inside them is finally at peace. Demarion stood at the door. Ezra was awake in the bed across the hall, tired and warm, and looking at the ceiling with the expression of a person who has set down something very heavy and is still getting used to their own hands being empty. Demarion looked at both of them, at the 2 boys in the crib, at the man across the hall, at the room that had once been filled with screaming and had become, through hard work and honesty and one person's willingness to walk through a door they weren't supposed to walk through, the quietest place in the building. And he thought about Broderick Wynne, who was facing federal charges, about Caius Remington, who had lost everything he had built, about Terence Voss, who had traded what he knew for a deal that still wasn't going to save him very much. He thought about all the people who had spent months trying to find a weakness in Demarion Calloway's empire. And he thought about the fact that the real thing worth protecting had never been the ports or the contracts or the hedge funds. It had been this room, these 2 small people, this man 2 doors down. He had almost missed that, not because he was blind, because he had been trained from the very beginning of his life to look at power as the thing that made everything else safe. And power, he now understood, was the thing that had been making his own child afraid. The learning curve on that was steep, and the cost of it was real. And the only reason he had made it through was because someone had refused to be excluded from a room where they were needed, and had chosen honesty over comfort in every single moment that counted. Demarion turned away from the nursery window. He walked back to Ezra's room. He sat in the chair beside the bed. Ezra looked at him. "You're going to sit there?" Ezra said. "For a while," Demarion said. Ezra looked back at the ceiling. "Okay," he said. Outside, the rain kept moving. The city kept going. The river kept carrying its weight toward the harbor. And on the 14th floor of a private hospital overlooking the Hudson, 2 men sat in a quiet room with nothing left to protect against and everything still ahead of them. That was enough. That was, in every way that mattered, more than enough. And if this story moved you, if you saw yourself or someone you love in the choice Demarion made, or in the quiet strength of Ezra refusing to disappear, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us which moment hit you the hardest. Tell us what you think real strength actually looks like. This channel exists for stories that make you feel something real, and your voice in the comments is what keeps these stories coming. If you are not subscribed yet, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every week there is a new story on this channel. Stories about love that cost something, about people who chose to grow instead of collapse, about the kind of strength that does not announce itself. You do not want to miss what comes next. And if this story meant something to you, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear it. You already know who.